Okay, so I think we can get started because I know Rebecca has a busy afternoon as well. Thanks everyone for joining this lunchtime seminar today. We're very pleased to be presenting Rebecca Page-Tickett, who is the Director of Education and Experience for the Royal Docklands School of Business and Law at UEL. She has worked in higher education for well over a decade, I think now, both in face-to-face and online forms of delivery, both blended and distance. She's got a huge number of qualifications. I'm amazed at how much she's actually achieved. She's got a BSc, MA, MSc, MBA, and is currently working on her PhD, where her primary research interest is the use of gig workers in academia. And today she's going to be talking to us about exploring staff and student opinions about university spaces, accounting for atmosphere, presence, and communities of inquiry. So without further ado, now the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mel. And hello, everyone. I'm really, really pleased to be here to share some work that I did, really trying to understand how different people relate to spaces, both the spaces that we have physically and the spaces that we have virtually. So I should say at the beginning, the focus was on physical spaces and really but before I say that, I'm going to share my screen and apologise for my cold. I should be okay, I've got a glass here, but if there are any problems, then we could stop for a minute. But once I've shared my screen, I won't be able to see the chat. So please do feel free to just speak into the session. I'm happy to take questions at any point. But if people do put things in the chat, Mel, maybe you could bring them up at an appropriate point.
That's fine.
Thank you. So let me share my screen now. I'll just start the slideshow. Okay, so so this piece of work came about because of our experience of this building. So the building that you can see is where the Business and Law School is based. And you'll see as we're going through it that it's not always been a happy building to be in. It is very much in the middle of quite a built-up area. It's not necessarily that easy to find. And I mean, if you just look at the building, think about, you know, what do you think when you see that building? So some people would be saying, oh, it looks very modern, it looks very engaging. Other people would say that it's glowering, black, dark, oppressive. So these are all really important things when we're thinking about learning teaching because of the importance of atmosphere. So this research was kind of put together really before the pandemic hit, but then was implemented during the pandemic. So it's trying to understand, as staff, what do we think about this space and what affordances do we take advantage of? And for students, what are their perceptions and what affordances do they take advantage of? Focusing here really on communities of inquiry, atmosphere, and presence, and socio-materiality really in terms of the atmosphere and presence. So, no, it won't. There we go. Can you all see the agenda now? Hands up. Or Mel, can you see the agenda?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So what I wanted to go through is to look at the topic and its importance, go through some of the method, and then start to look at the findings. And it will be a bit interactive, I'm afraid. There will be things for people to do. And I will aim to finish by 2 o'clock. So as I said, this has had a very practical genesis in terms of really, so I'm the Director for Education and Experience in the school, and I really wanted to know why is it students are not engaging as we'd like them to, and what can we do to support that? So as well as being kind of a point of academic interest, but also here there's a very practical piece that we wanted to use this research to help inform our redesign of the space. And that's an ongoing project, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. One of the things that excited me about this project was the method I used, and we're going to trial some of that method. So I used inquiry graphics. It's the first time I'd come across that. I can really recommend it as a method. And then the findings were particularly interesting here. So if we think about space, this is our first floor space as it was in the building. And this was a space that had been insisted upon as students need this space because they need to have a clear space for sitting and working individually. But the space actually wasn't used very much. So space is really deterministic of how we interact and how we react within spaces. It sets the agenda for ever such a lot of hierarchy, and it really, in many ways, dominates our relations and our discourse without really us noticing. That's the really interesting part of it. We tend not to notice what's going on with space. So it's invisible, taken for granted, but also very influential. And I'm going to show you the photos which I used in the research, which are photos of the estate that we use. And the photos were all taken by our estates manager, because I didn't want to, I mean, obviously I have preferences with the spaces, and I didn't want any of my preferences to influence what I was doing. So these are all neutral photos taken by the estates manager during the lockdown. So you will see that they are very empty and there are no people in it. And that's because people weren't allowed in them. Excuse me. And so one of the things that I did during the interviews was try to draw people back into thinking about what the learning experience was in these spaces and how that related to the experience that they had while they were learning online. So what we find is that space is very important, but perhaps not researched as much as it could be. So there are a lot of findings around space. So if we have active learning classrooms, they do offer an uplift in performance. If we can have flexibility in classes, that encourages attendance rates. Then there's this correlation, isn't there, between attendance and outcome. So therefore, design of these spaces becomes very important. And we particularly wanted to look at how COVID-19 has impacted the experience of space and the understanding of space. So this space was really interesting. This is a space which is on the first floor. It's one of our students' kind of rest spaces, as it were, and yet very underutilized. And if you see in the edge, where you've got the number 1, there's some spaces there which had been conceived, as I understand it, as spaces which gave a sense of kind of privacy. People could be there facing the wall, focusing on their work, but students experienced that as a place of exposure. They were almost always empty. So the design of the space here became particularly important. So really, the question that we're asking here is, well, what is this space? So this space that we had during the pandemic, what is it? How is it constructed? How do we conceive of it? And how is that conception changed across different groups of people? So if you think about this space, there are lots of different elements of this space. So first of all, there's the classroom, and the top left-hand picture. It's such a good picture, I think. There's an issue that we have. So this top left-hand, you can see the red chairs, the individual desks. So this room, in the very original time when it was designed, really, it's got beautiful light there. It's absolutely, and a nice view out across different parts of Stratford. But estates will continually lay it out like this, which can be really concerning for students, you know. So there's a sense here of exams, discipline. One student even referred to detention, made them feel like that they were in secondary school. And so there's this space here, students have historically, and then there's the space we see in the middle. So within all of this, there's some sense of precarity, of having to share resources, of the digital divide that we experience, where families might be fighting for one laptop and having to share it. So in this image, which is just a stock image, I'm kind of conceiving of the woman as the mother who's trying to get access to that computer, but feeling that she mustn't, damage her child who is also learning on the one PC. And then at the same time, we have this idea of isolation in the right-hand side. And in the bottom picture, an embedded turning to an intensive space of learning. And then I'm sure everyone will recognise on the bottom left hand that experience that we have. Now we're back in the classrooms of loads and loads of icons, which we hope might be videos turned on, but not always. I'm kind of feeling a sense of, I think that came across mostly in the pandemic, dislocation. Somehow we are out of this space. We almost become external people observing the space. So within all of this, I've taken a turn to the mobilities. So what that means is conceiving of the social space, of the hierarchy, of the physicality, in terms of the people moving within it. Kind of instead of seeing here is a physical space, which is the classroom, and then here is the social space that people have, within their homes and within the sense of their being. And then here we have the learning space. Actually, those all go together. And there's a holistic piece about a person within those, and then relationally, all of the people within those spaces. So this space then becomes contested, becomes known for an individual, but also shared. And so we therefore have less opportunity to influence it, particularly intentionally, in terms of designing space, using the VLE, using the kind of design of sessions, but also using the design of the physical space, because it's experienced individually by people in lots of different places and different spaces. So that's what this research was really about, trying to understand, what is this space? And actually, if we can really understand the individual, the relational, and the communal experience of this space, perhaps then we can start to intentionally shape those spaces in order to engage students back in. Because I think that probably is the most pressing need. How can we engage students back in? There seems to be across schools, institutions, and also internationally, there seems to be a real pressing need to re-engage students back in, which I will come to in a little bit. So the three kind of theoretical areas that I apply this mobilities term to are, first of all, community of inquiry. And that's really the kind of the most novel piece, because community of inquiry was developed for distance learning, and we're applying it here to this kind of hybrid of physical and distance learning, which interestingly has been compelled. No one chose to stay at home and be isolated. We were compelled to by the pandemic. So within that is the kind of important area of atmosphere and socio-materiality, trying to understand what are the affordances that we have here, and what's that atmosphere. I'll go into that a bit more. And then understanding the topologies of space. This is a really rich and useful approach from modern law, not that recent, 2001, but very rich for understanding what's going on around here and how can we influence it. Because all of this really is kind of tilting towards enhancing student experience, enhancing outcomes, enhancing good degrees, and enhancing what, our good students pay a lot of money for. So how can we help them with that? So the way that I've done that is looking at inquiry graphics. If anyone is interested in this afterwards, then I would suggest, now I've given the wrong quotation here, apologies for that. There is a book that's come out relatively recently. The person who wrote it, whose name should be here, is Natasha Lakovic, Natasha Lakovic. The book is called Inquiry Graphics in Higher Education. And it is a very, very simple but profound, complex, useful method to use. So inquiry graphics are graphics which are integrated within concepts or thematic units across educational domains, thus forming integral signs of knowledge development. So inquiry graphics is using graphics to try to get to understand what concepts people have. So it's very, very relational. It's all about the relationship between individual people, people as groups, the concepts that they have, the images that they see, the knowledge that they're trying to develop and engage, and in this case, the spaces. So it's also very dialogic. It's all about building a shared understanding through dialogue. And essentially what you're doing is using some kind of a graphic as a stimulus. Now that could be brought about by the person themselves who you are interviewing or you're trying to engage with, or it could be generated by yourself, or together you could choose something else. But the graphic allows you to slow down and move away from that person's initial first thoughts. So it's very, very reflective. And what it does is it engages both memory and affect. So here's a picture. What does it make you think? What do you observe? What does it denote? And what does it connote? So, for example, you might want to say, we can see a bus going down the street. What do you see? You see the bus. What does that denote? That denotes that people are travelling. That denotes that there's movement. What does that connote? What's the connotation of that? Actually, the bus is full. So the connotation of that is that the pandemic is drawing to a close. The connotation of that is that I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful that this period of our lives is going to end. And how does that make you feel? What are you doing with that? What's next? So you take the very, very simple thing of, here's a picture of a bus going down a street near here, and you move quite quickly into exposing people's concepts, their feelings, their affect, and moving forward with all of that. So it also allows us to have a collaborative endeavour, really, through simply, in my case, a thematic analysis, but obviously it could be done in very different ways. It's also exploratory. So we are working from the ground up, allowing people to generate their own constructs. Now I have applied the theories that I discussed there on top of that, but it does come from ground up. Or it could more come from ground up, I suppose. So what I would like you to do is have a look at this image here. So this is of our ground floor before we did all the work. So there was a lot of work that was done within USS. We now have quite a thriving ground floor. Not today because the boilers have broken and students have been suggested that they don't come in, but ordinarily it's quite a thriving area now. So what you can see on the right is the interview schedule, really, that I ran through. So first of all, I would ask people who came along how familiar they were with USS. Is it something that they knew well? Is it that, how were they with USS? Did they understand it? So University Square, Stratford is the building that we have here. I wanted to know what they thought about it. Yeah. And then we talked about atmosphere. So atmosphere is a very interesting thing because it's experienced both individually and as a group. And atmosphere, again, is a taken for granted expectation that is implicit but has a huge impact on the experience of activities. So as you look at this, would anyone like to say what they think the atmosphere here is? What atmosphere do you conceive of in this place? What atmosphere is this?
Well, this is Regina. I'll jump in. Hi. So the hard surfaces make it feel a bit cold, but the positioning of the seating gives it welcomes opportunity for dialogue. So in some ways, it's almost conflicting, really, and I guess it depends on the echoes around the space, how comfortable people are about the volumes of their voices. We find in libraries, for example, that users are self-regulating. If they're sitting around a group of people laughing loudly, they'll laugh and speak. If people are whispering, they tend to whisper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So cold and hard were definitely some of the words that came up. And this was an interesting piece because if I said, for example, I might say this is the lobby of a hospital, you might feel very differently about it immediately because hospital suggests, illness, precarity, something unpleasant. Or I might say this is a very large dental waiting room, or it might be an airport lounge, which might have an atmosphere of, there's some concern because you're going to go through security, but actually it's a bit of an exciting place to go to an airport lounge. So atmosphere becomes something that's shared, and we spent some time talking through what atmosphere means here. Then ask people to list the elements. So they would literally go through and say, well, there are 4 single blue chairs. And as Regina said, which is interesting because how could I sit and have a conversation there out in that huge open space? But it seems to be asking me to have a conversation. And I should point out that this is the furniture that was purchased for the pandemic. So it is socially distanced and trying to keep people apart as well as in some way together. So by listing the elements, you're starting that reflection of getting people to look more closely at what is here and to think about it. So then moving on to ask people to describe the image and its use. So that's the denotation. What does it denote that we have this here? So having the blue chairs facing one another denotes that we're expecting some level of conversation to happen. Whereas having those high chairs facing the wall denotes that we are expecting people to do some individual work alone. And then actually, what could these elements be used for? What does it connote? What's the connotation here? Well, actually, maybe you could put the chairs together in a much more friendly way and have shared conversations instead of suggesting that you can only have a conversation in pairs. Perhaps you could put the tables one on top of one another and have the high chairs around them so that you could have maybe even an eating area, have more conversation. Perhaps you could, all sorts of other ideas, all sorts of other things coming up. And then the final part of the interview was to say, well, what does that mean for teaching learning? So if we think about communities of inquiry, in particular here, what does it mean for social presence? Well, actually, social presence is really constrained here, isn't it? Because you're either working alone, facing a wall, or you're in pairs. So how do you build up kind of a shared understanding of things, which is such an important part of the whole learning teaching experience? And I should say here that I talk about learning teaching because I don't think you can really separate out learning and teaching as 2 entirely separate things. They are very much embedded and welded together. So I cannot remember the name. It's not my term. It's a term which belongs to someone else. And if I remember the name, I'll say it. But definitely, I think learning teaching is really key here. So that was the activity that I took people through. I had 6 different images, as I said, all of them taken by the estates manager. And we went through the images one by one to really understand what their constructs for learning teaching, for community of inquiry, and for atmosphere were, and what that meant in terms then of how they engaged as staff, as students, or as learning teaching specialists. So there were 16 semi-structured interviews conducted. 5 of them were with students, 7 of them were with academics, and 4 of them were with specialist learning teaching people, learning, teaching and assessment. So I should say a big thank you to anyone who's in the room who took part in the interviews. It was really very rich, I found, things that came up. So let's look at the findings. Let's move on. Any questions, first of all, actually, in terms of the method or the topic? Perfect. Okay. If there are any questions, just do feel free to put them in the chat. So the atmosphere, first of all, comments from students in the blue, from academics in the green, and then from specialists, learning and teaching people in that sort of very friendly olive green, I think, olive green at the bottom. So students thought that the atmosphere was compact. It's only really good for going there for your classes. Oh, it's ever so organised and professional. It's quite business and corporate. So none of that, to me, sounds like, oh, I love it. I go there, I sit there, I have a great time. I had one student who said, so for those who don't know the layout here, this building is relatively isolated from our other 2 campuses. And in fact, there's a debate about, is this building a campus on its own, or is it part of our Stratford campus? So students with an hour gap would leave this building, would go to the Stratford campus, into a room with bean bags that they felt very homely. They would have their lunch there, and then they would walk back. It's about a 10-minute walk each way. They would walk back within an hour just to avoid being in this building. So there was a very strong sense of unwelcome. And I've bracketed it like that because actually, when you went to academics, they found it not too bad. Specialist learning and teaching people found it friendly and welcoming. So this thing about welcome was really, really important with this. But from students, there was a sense of this building being aversive and closed off, very transient. So that's why I used those terms earlier. It's like a well-designed airport. It's like a hospital ward. It's bland. Sorry, that should say cold. It's cold and bland. It's an empty space. It's soulless. I don't want to be here. It's aversive. So the impact of that on their learning and teaching is, I don't want to be there. I'm going to be here because you make me be here, but I don't actually want to be in this building. I want to be somewhere else. Think of the impact of that on our commuter students. Our students are primarily commuter students. We have a lot of students who have families, who have other responsibilities, who have other jobs. And with our estate, we're kind of saying, don't come here. It's not that nice. Food's expensive. It's not really anywhere to sit privately and comfortably. Don't come. Not intentionally, but through the atmosphere. For colleagues who are academics who work here on a regular basis, modern, clean, sterile. Lovely, modern, shiny, kind of a flagship, nice office space. But it's not like a university, is it? And this I thought was really interesting. You don't see any notices. So you don't see people hanging around. You don't really see student activities. There's no graffiti. There's no misbehaviour. So this is an atmosphere that is quite controlling. And someone said, well, it's a lot like a prison. So someone said a lot of the time in a prison, when they design a prison, they design it so that everyone can be seen at every time. And if you go into the middle of this building, there are windows all around from a very high 4th floor atrium in the middle. And what that means is that most of the time, in most rooms, you can be observed by at least one person. So there's a real panopticon effect. There's an effect of being observed. As an atmosphere of observation, that becomes constraining, and it means that colleagues also felt very observed. And some colleagues went into some detail explaining to me where they sit with their desks so that students can't peer in on them. So that gave a sense of claustrophobia to people, kind of a sense of precarity. As people walk across, we have a bridge. On the 2nd floor is where most of the offices are. And at that place, there's a bridge from the lift and the stairs across into the offices. And people described waiting to see if students were going to pounce on them as they came across. So this sense of being aversive was much less strong for academics, but nonetheless there. Specialist learning and teaching staff visit this building. They don't come into it a lot. So they had a sense of it being friendly and welcoming, being quite tech savvy. So you can see already there's a real sense of difference across the 3 groups of how they experience the space. Then we go on to look at socio-materiality. So socio-materiality is about the people who we interviewed, their construction of space as active members of the school community. So this is about understanding the physical and virtual entities and their affordances. What does that give me? What can I use that for? What does this particular thing afford? So what we found was that the affordances of this were very much for the whole building around focusing on the academic as the sage on the stage. So there was for me, there was quite a sadness in this, because that assumes that the students are passive, that the sage has everything to give them, that they will passively receive what the sage says, and that person on the stage will be on the stage for a period, and then they will leave the stage, and then they're not available. And then the compulsion for going online really reinforced this sense of the sage on the stage. So there's this one person in my little video box, there's one person who knows everything, and they're going to tell me, and I might just watch the video, or I might take notes, and then I will have what I need to have known. The idea of actively engaging with the learning and having a vibrant community seemed to be absent. The size of the room was identified as really key to build communication through dual delivery. So a couple of times students in particular would say, I like it when someone's delivering from this room or delivering from that room, because you can get a sense of who's in the room physically, who's in the room virtually, and understanding who's there, so you feel like a community. But the socio-materiality really led to a performative engagement, which is really interesting. And this came from staff. So you can pretend to have the game of discussion, but I'm going to tell you what it is, what's what at the end. So a kind of a performative thing where students are understanding that this is trying to be a business building, and so the socio-materiality is all around, let's think about businesses, let's think about working in a for-profit setting. So use of white and sterility was identified frequently in a very aversive way, with one student in particular suggesting that it made them feel quite anxious. So it's not friendly or fun. So again, tending to reduce passivity and reduced engagement. But the quality of materials was noted. So a lot of people said they really liked all the concrete around the place. And where we use wood, that was understood as a proxy for value. So students saw that they were valued by the use of wood, with the intention that they were enabling the learning, and saying, well, it's very well thought out, which in the middle of those interviews, I kind of heard as I was grateful really that they saw that it was well thought out. So just, I'm sure all of you know communities of inquiry really well, but just kind of to explain it, we've got these three presences. The social presence, so the who I am as a person, bringing myself forward to engage with the other people and build relationship. Communities of inquiry were developed initially for distance learning, and here we're applying them to physical as well as distance situations. So there's something here about how can I have a presence of who I am. If I am in my bedroom, my sitting room, and I'm fighting for time on the laptop or my camera's not working, how can I have a presence? And how can I do that in a way that's risk-free? Then cognitive presence. How can I share my ideas? How can I check out my learning? How can I apply new ideas in a cognitive presence? Now, together, those should allow a supporting discourse. And I think this is the area that we really need to work on now, in terms of re-engaging students while so many of them are still attending online. So how can we really build that supporting discourse by building social presence and cognitive presence? And then teaching presence is, you know, both the people, but also the material. So what's on the VLE, the learning journey that you see on the VLE, the curricula, the assessments, all of that is the teaching presence. So that should enable some kind of supportive regulation of the learning with cognitive presence. We should be able to use that to set a climate in the social presence. So let's look at what we found. So social presence in informal spaces. This is what you can see there on the right is the second floor bridge with the offices around the edge of it. So students, you can see, thought that USS wasn't really social. There aren't many social areas. They thought it was very not private. They thought it was very transient. And whenever they discussed it, they talked about meeting people to go through to somewhere. They were never just meeting here. They were meeting in order to go somewhere else. There's never anywhere to sit and have a chat with your friends. Whereas academics thought it was the ideal communal place. It's really not a building that invites people to sit around and chat and read. And importantly, there's no space that belongs to students. And that's one of the things we've really tried to do moving forward. We've brought a whole new set of furniture and we've created little cabins. We've created spaces, just tucked away spaces with sofas and bean bags. And that's had a huge impact in terms of stickiness of students just hanging around, just staying in the building. Specialist L&T people thought that there was some sense of social communication could be developed through the cafe and seating. So you can already see how your position has more of an impact on how you conceive the space than the actual space itself. Students, very aversive. I'll go there because it's where my lectures are, but otherwise I would not enter this building. Some academics saw it as an ideal communal place, but some others recognised that it wasn't very inviting. Specialist L&T people who don't actively, regularly use the building saw the intention with the cafe and everywhere else for it to be used for social communication, but that wasn't what regular users experienced. Now, I had some learning here about ordering. I showed this image on the right first, and so I got most interest information through that one image, and all the other images really got as much, if not less than, this one image. So I'll focus on this one image for most of the conversation around what we found. Students love this room. This is our Harvard lecture room. It takes about 70 people. You've got the chair here. Behind the chair is the screen. You can see there in the top, you should be able to see the microphones, and they're very small. I think you just see them, and there's a camera there. So this is all set up for dual delivery learning, where we both teach physically in the room and also simultaneously synchronously live stream it and record the sessions. So students really enjoyed this. They enjoyed it because they could speak to everyone. They said that there was a lot of good conversation in this room because you could see people. So although in one sense it does speak to the sage on a stage, at the same time, because there are students around in both spaces, there's an opportunity to walk out and engage students by walking around the room. As students said, they really enjoyed lectures and seminars. You see here again, see each other and speak to each other. Academics split into a couple of groups here. Those academics who taught law loved it. Words like gladiatorial, hot, risky really were brought up here, and they loved going in and building that social experience through questioning and engaging. But they found it very theatrical and had kind of a frisson for them, you know. Specialist learning and teaching colleagues thought it had an inherent lack of engagement, of encouragement for students to engage. It will be difficult to get student engagement in a room like this, very difficult to get group work going. And I think that might be related to subject. So law, it's all about concepts and constructs, throw them out, debate them, throw them around. Whereas perhaps if you were doing accounting and finance, that might be much more needing to work things out and then ask an occasional question. Back to something like perhaps criminology or strategy, you'd be discussing things a lot more. So again, we can see that there's a real positional thing going on here. So these are our other formal spaces, and I hope you can see here what I was talking about earlier in terms of atmosphere. The picture on the right was described as like a spaceship. And the more I saw it, the more I felt like I was in some intergalactic mission. That was actually our courtroom, or our mooting room, set up to be like a courtroom, but very inappropriately spaced room, used very as little as possible. People would fight to get into that Harvard room, but for this room, people would avoid as much as they could. So social presence in the other formal spaces, students said essentially they hated it, like detention, made me anxious. One student, I got a bit concerned, she talked about a difficult experience she'd had in one of these rooms. Academics thought it was kind of practical because it was flexible, but passive, less active. Specialist L&T people thought you just sigh and be trying to work out why people are being asked to do stuff in isolation. And that whole thing about the factory of education. You know, you come in here, you attend your class, you get your stamp, and you go off. Because there's that conflation, isn't there, between attendance and engagement. And now that we're able to measure every touch point that students have, there is possibly that category error of measuring attendance instead of engagement. So strong conveyor belt sense given. And you can see how this room is not laid out for social presence. This room is laid out for passive listening and acceptance of knowledge. You have to really strain your back to talk to the person behind you. So cognitive presence was for the building as a whole. This image on the right is a stock image of the middle of the building as it used to be. There are quite a few more pieces of furniture in there now, and this is not an image I used. So students thought that actually this building is complex, it's confusing, it's a little bit intimidating. I can get easily lost, and it is very easy to get lost in this building. It's laid out in a figure of 8. And they privileged their emotional response. It was very interesting, their response related to the atmosphere, I think. They talked about being stressed. It makes me so stressed, I'm rigid. I find it calm, it's neutral, it's calm. But you can see there that the cognitive side has not been at all about I'm able to sit and debate ideas, I'm able to test out my thoughts. It's much more, how do I find my way around this place? Academic staff thought that there were some good places for meetings in the building, but there was little cognitive debate generated throughout the building as a whole. And Special L&T didn't mention cognitive presence at all, which I thought was very interesting, given that this is a university building. Surely we should be trying to engage debate throughout the whole building. However, cognitive presence in Formal Space 1, academics talked a lot about debate and discussion and how it was used to put people on the spot. They either rise to it or they don't, and if they don't, they just kind of die a death somewhere. So this is a tough room for people to be in. Students talked about academics looking them in the eye, that you couldn't hide in this room, everyone could see you. And there's been an interesting piece about, if you were in a room like this, a lot of colleagues will have the skills to be quite confrontational and then deflate that with a joke, with moving away, having a break. But those skills are very different if you're teaching online or in dual delivery, where that construct of one space has changed. So how do we understand both of those spaces is what I would really like to know, to be honest. So students said lecturers can speak to everyone. It's very good for dual delivery. So this is teaching presence, sorry. Academics said there's a real sense of hierarchy here. The format of these big solid desks, so you can see that whole space in front of you, that's actually a standing height, but normally doesn't work. So it's quite problematic in that room. As soon as you move from a corridor into a classroom, you transition from modern, clearly well-designed space into a fairly bog-standard traditional space. Desks in rows, computer desks where a lecturer can hide. And the specialist LTA noted that this privileges the teacher presence at the expense of the student. So there's this very strong idea of the sage on the stage. I'm the one who knows, I'm the one who's going to impart knowledge. But again, note the contrast between what specialist LTA thought, what academics thought, and what students thought. Three very different experiences of one space. So that's everything around communities of inquiry. And I hope you can see that there was no real good, coherent outcome there. Social presence was really suppressed in a lot of places. Cognitive presence was not really raised up enough. And teaching presence was really quite hidden. And the learning journey wasn't referred to as much as the presence of academic staff, which is perhaps a little bit disappointing, really. So let's think about topologies of space. So topologies of space is an approach put forward by Law and Moll, which understands it. So topologies refers to, think of an OS map, an idea of valleys and hills and a changing space as well. So you might get a piece of fairly rigid foil and move it around and change it to create different topologies which interact. Because in the mobilities turn, we're thinking about the holistic person and how that individual and groups of individuals relate to each of these four constructs that we have here. So regional, networked, fluid, and fire. So regional is about the actual physical space. What is it to be an East London university? What is it to be an East London student? What's different between being a Docklands student, a Stratford student, and a USS student? So the physical spaces are characterised by these hard material boundaries. And of course, students are devalued by that, because if you've got one student in a room, this is the lecture that's happening. If you've got 50 students in a room, this is the lecture that's happening. So in a way, the student is entirely irrelevant. There is a lot here that's given and very, very little that's co-constructed. So in terms of regional topologies, that's an understanding of what the affordances of the physical and virtual spaces are. And they are much, much about a one-way travel of information. which you hope to pick up later in an assignment. And I think colleagues work really hard to try and engage students back in and try and have some co-construction, which is what we were used to before the pandemic. But for reasons, I think, of dislocation and almost disconnectedness, students are parceling out their time so that instead of being 100% in, they're in when they need to attend a lecture, and then they become passive consumers of knowledge rather than co-creators. So regional is very, very important. Then networked is really all about how we're networking. You know, think about that IT thing of networking, the online stuff with the physical stuff, with meeting my student colleagues in the local cafe for lunch to discuss things, with going into the library, with going across to that other location, student union perhaps. So colleagues said that they felt it really as a network. They couldn't untangle their experiences as an employee with experiences of the building. So one academic thought the materiality was really cosmetic and separate from the experience of being in the space, while the students acknowledged the impact of the visual stimulus on appreciating their lived experience of the space, commenting that the atmosphere was not just in this picture, but in person as well. Thankfully validating the whole thing then. Because remember, a lot of this was memory. People weren't allowed access to the buildings. So regional, physical barriers, networked, how we network between each of these things, and then fluid is around learning journeys. That one individual, those groups having learning journeys. A comment from an academic on the physical and online spaces in the same comparison, connecting the physical and online spaces with no gap between them, but rather constructing them as one overarching space. So it was nice to see a sense of foregrounding the learning journeys, but that was one academic out of 7 discussed that. So I think it would be good for us to start to think more about the learning journey across the affordances of each of these separate spaces coming into one. Then fire is all about the emotions really, and about the vivacity of the space. So the space that needs to be filled in order to create an environment of activity. When there are loads of students here, it can have an excellent atmosphere. And certainly in this building, we also have the ACI, Arts and Creative Industries. And so we sometimes get amazing concerts from them. They'll come down, they'll do some singing, some playing music. And quite often the room I'm in the building, you'll hear the drumming from above. It can feel quite lively, but when it's empty, it's like something from a zombie film. So this is a place that really needs to be occupied. So moving towards the end, we've just got 5 minutes left. The implications for learning, teaching and assessment. We had a really conflicting atmosphere of privacy and safety versus visibility and exposure. And of course, the safety and privacy almost to the ground for people to be confident enough to allow themselves to be visible and exposed. And we see now that people have absolutely pulled back and are not really engaging and are just focusing on privacy and safety. There's also something in this building around a pedagopticon, so a pedagogy of a panopticon, that everything is observed. There's a potential for measurement of every touch point. There is no sense at which a trial would be without a problem, because you can always be measured. Everything you do can be observed. All sessions are recorded. Perhaps if we didn't record our lectures and our seminars, students would engage in them a lot more. There's a real atmosphere here of unwelcome that was really noted, and this is seen as a transitory and unhomely space. There's a real dialogue lack. So we don't see misbehaviour from students, we don't see graffiti, we don't see student notices, we don't see students hanging around. This is a professional building that people come into and go out of. Since doing this, we have been working really hard to try and change that, but I think we're part of the way, but I don't think we're there yet. So that thing about performativity, students expressed a need to avoid disruption, to fit in, and students were almost saying that they need to be invisible. So if we think about students as the focus, the customers, the people who we need, the people that we're doing this for, and yet their sense from this is that they need to be invisible, just get through. So that student perspective was really, really heartfelt, and a couple of the interviews were particularly almost emotional at one point. They really had a deep desire for a rich community of inquiry, but somehow the atmosphere had pushed them back into that vulnerable, I know I must be safe. But there were changing perceptions of the learning spaces. So space and time were visited rather than permanently resided in. And I think this is partly to do with our commuter students. They fit in their visits to the university, and that's been exacerbated with the pandemic. So even now, I would say this place is a lot more welcoming, a lot more sticky, but I would love to see it more welcoming. I would love to have a breastfeeding room. I would love to have a room for students who are parents to bring children and study in that room. We're working on the garden. I think there's a lot more that we could do to make this a space that focuses on students and is student ready, rather than a place where we do teaching. Note I didn't say learning teaching, a place where we do teaching, that students come to consume that teaching, and the learning as a co-created living thing happens less. So in summary, people were talking about this building being uncomfortable. It's not a building that invites people to sit around and chat and read. There isn't a space that belongs to students. You don't get a sense of a student habitus. There's a lot in here about compliance and correct behaviour, professional transitory atmosphere, a lack of homeliness, and in the end, the performativity of students who are behaving to the expectations that they perceive. And the perceptions, the difference we saw between staff, academic staff, students and specialist learning and teaching, and their perceptions were related to their position instead of the place itself. So that's everything I wanted to say. I've included all my references here, so I will share the slides. I'll stop presenting there. So any questions?
Thank you, Rebecca, for that. Very interesting. Before we go into the questions, I'm just gonna go, I think it was Rosemary who had a question. I think it was the first one. Let me just go back. She was surprised. I think a couple of us were surprised in terms of the findings at USS over Stratford. And I think Rosemary asked if the comments from the students also came from students from performing arts, dance, music as well. Oh, there's Rosemary. Hi.
Hi, Rosemary. Lovely to see you. No, those comments have come from the business students. Yeah. No.
I'm thinking I should join your research project. It'd be really
please do. Let's do some more.
It'd be fascinating to see how the arts ones would respond to the same questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I used to work at Ravensbourne, University of London, which is a similar kind of building, and it's only arts and creative industries, and the students absolutely loved that building there. And it could be that art students who, in my experience, are very, they lay a lot of importance on the way things look, like aesthetics.
Yes,
is key to them. And you mentioned the quality of the materials, the concrete, the kind of look of the place. I mean, I can't predict what their response would be, but I would maybe think that they might be more positively inclined than the business ones, but it'd be really interesting to find out, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that would be fascinating. I would love to repeat the whole thing in about a year's time, because we've done so much work getting lots of different spaces for people to sit. I want to see, has it made a real difference? If I go out in a year's time, will those students still say, oh, it's unwelcoming? I mean, they might. But what more do we need to do? Because I think it's the relationship between attendance and outcomes. and if we're putting students off attending. But I think there's also another piece, which is that not very often, that's not fair. It appears that occasionally students will take something like business management because they're not sure what else to do. Whereas I'm sure that if students are going to do something in performing arts or in media, they've really thought about it and they've got a passion for it and they're fighting for it. So there's a different kind of expectation.
That's where we're lucky. Yeah, a lot of the time that is the case. But it was fascinating stuff, Rebecca. Really absolutely enjoyed to hear about your research and what you're doing, and let's talk more.
Yeah, no, let's. I think there's so much to I mean, you know, this is just scratching the surface, isn't it? There's so much more to know.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks. We've got 2 more questions. I think first is Jennifer and then Mary. So Jennifer, please.
Hi, I'm not sure if my camera's going to work. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I'm not from this university at all. I'm an external person, and I was interested with Rosemary saying about other students. Is it that this building is used by students from multiple departments and multiple faculties, or is it just business and law?
So it is open. Many of the rooms are what we call pool rooms, but it's primarily business and law. And then also, so we've got the areas that I didn't look at where we've got dance studios and that sort of thing, but I didn't look at that floor at all. I was kind of, because it's my school, probably a bit selfishly, apologies, I was focusing on my students.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because sometimes when it's used, when a building's kind of pooled in that way, it almost becomes kind of institutional. So you get that macro level identity rather than those kind of individual identities of different schools, and then it does feel a bit, as you're saying, kind of institutional because it is the institutional messages rather than the departmental. Yeah, no, absolutely, and then that becomes a real issue, doesn't it? So we're constantly fighting. I referred to you know, the estates people putting the classroom back in a way we don't like it, or you know, if a student dares to put a poster up, it will immediately be taken down. Well, literally displaced. The students' posters and messages get displaced. Precisely, so, utterly, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks for that. Thanks, Jennifer.
But maybe I'll just add that it's actually a significant number of the arts and creative industry students who are there. It's performing arts, music, and dance. But I don't know the building so well because I'm on the media side and we're at Docklands. But I think what I've seen from my visits to USS, you know, they're on the 3rd floor, aren't they, Rebecca? But perhaps there isn't as much mixing as there might be. And in my mind, you know, we have some elements on our courses of business and enterprise. You know, if we did more mixing, it would be great. Then it would actually improve that. You know. Yeah, no, absolutely. Perhaps they're a bit siloed within the building, and the art students going up to the 3rd floor and feeling that's their space. Probably. I mean, there is that open plan space. I mean, certainly when I visited, it was very lively and it's very lively and it's very available for anyone. I mean, anyone can walk in and use it. Well, anyone who's got, you know, a university card and can get through the barrier can walk in and use it. I think we really need. It's early days. We're still not over the pandemic, but we really need to develop that more, I think. But maybe that's why staff are more positive, because the times I've come, I was really pleased that there was a space where I could work. Because that's not my home campus. Whereas at Stratford, when I visited there, I wasn't really sure where to go and ended up going to the canteen. So, you know, it's a very obvious space where people can, you know, log on to university systems and so on. So I think that's a positive. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. We've got another question from Mary.
Hello.
Hi,
Rebecca. Hi, Rosemary.
Mary, you're going to be honest about what you do.
I timetable for the university, so we do look after a lot of these spaces or the use of these spaces. However, we're not space management, and you might have seen my query earlier on whether space management was included in this or whether they are attending this session. and whether they are included in the conversation when you made this, when you do this research. It's very interesting, I have to say. It's almost like an architectural approach to the space rather than a more managerial or business approach to this research. So it's interesting. However, how does your research connect to, or rather, I shouldn't say connect to, because I was about to say connected campus. Has UEB looked into USS? Have they actually considered USS in the connected campus project at all? They've only looked at, as far as I know, some of the spaces, but not the teaching space, for example, or the open space of USS. Have you heard
I mean, I think one of the things is that, you know, it all costs huge sums of money. So, you know, you have to be careful where you're focusing your time and your effort. So we felt that the biggest thing, and what this research showed, was that the biggest thing was the unwelcome. So that's the first thing we really tried to address, to make it welcome. I would love to do a lot more in the classrooms, make them much more flexible, and, you know, there's a lot more that we could do with different spaces. And the space management team were involved, of course they were completely involved in the design stage. I didn't interview anyone from the space team. They took the photos for me. They weren't that keen to be interviewed. They could have been, but they weren't that keen to be.
I was going to say, I don't know when you joined, Rebecca, but I was here when USS was being designed and when it was built. No, okay. So I think the USS was actually built with performing arts in mind. And later on, during building, during construction stage, suddenly business and law practically had taken over the use of this building. So it's sort of mixed use, and I think the overall finishing of surfaces, like your flooring, your walls and all that, they were designed with performing arts in mind. And at some stage, I think performing arts had, some of the floors have mixed use. So some of the floors have performing arts, music suites, etc., mixed with a normal pool teaching rooms. And there were complaints about the noise that comes from these spaces, and therefore they were segregated. So level 3, you see is heavily used by the music and performing arts people. So I guess the design of the building didn't really have business law in mind. And also, while you think that the space may look a bit cold and clinical almost, when you think about your courses as being business, you want that corporate feel. So when you walk in, you actually may not want the feeling of being in university.
You're right, Mary. But I think it's a balance. It's a balance, isn't it? And that's the trouble. So it needs to be, you know, this is almost, let's think about, you know, authenticity and the career journey. This is almost like going into an office, but you're still a student. And I think it's the balance. I think we've got a little bit too much towards, let's pretend you're going to work, and a little bit less towards, now here's your student experience.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, I do think the conversation needs to keep going between yourself and space management and the students as well. Obviously, students are a most important part in this in the design process. I don't know if the students were consulted at the design of this building, but surely if we are to improve this building, then we need to get them more involved. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming in. Thank you, Mary. And agree with you, Regina, because we do now have, what I didn't refer to here is we've got lots of different spaces that we've created now. So like a trading floor, we've got a courtroom, we've got strategic labs and all sorts of different things like that, which weren't there before. But I'm hoping that will improve room usage because they're very heavily used and really preferred because they create a good learning teaching experience.
And I think the other comment that we have came from Ella a while ago, saying that she was a commuter student herself, and as such she often prioritized dual use spaces. So the library was a good space for use, especially on the lunch break, but USS doesn't have that space. So maybe that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You should come over, Ella, come and see the space.
I'd love to. I'll be in tomorrow, hopefully.
Oh, good. Might see you then. Jonathan's made an interesting comment. Thanks, Regina. Jonathan's made an interesting comment about navigating between student satisfaction and expectation and pedagogical needs. And that's really interesting, isn't it? I do think we need to risk dissatisfaction. You know, we need to allow our students to feel discomfort in order to enable them to learn. It's no good having a nice marshmallowy experience and coming out with nothing.
But yeah, if there are no further questions, I'm sure that you can still anyway contact Rebecca if
No, absolutely. And Melissa, shall I send you the slides?
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, we'll still make the recording available. We'll put it on our YouTube channel so that internal and externals can also access it. So I need John's help for that. But yes, it'll be done in a few days. Thank you for presenting. I hope you enjoyed it. We did. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mel. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.